My husband and his friends thought it'd be funny to leave me stranded in a small town in Italy. That's what he told himself as he laughed and drove off. But what began as a cruel prank turned into something he couldn't control, the moment I stopped being his and started becoming mine. This isn't just a travel betrayal story, it's about being stranded by the person who promised to protect you and choosing not to return. From being abandoned in a cobblestone alleyway with no money and no way home, to working olive groves in Greece and building something real with her own hands, Nina's story is about reclaiming identity through labor, silence, and dignity, not drama. She didn't fight back with fury. She walked forward with intention, and in a village where no one knew her past, she finally remembered who she was. Watch this emotional journey unfold in My Husband and His Friends Thought It'd Be Funny to Leave Me Stranded in a Small Town in Italy. A story about olive branches, not apologies, about pressing soap, not pressing charges, and about growing something stronger than revenge, peace. Stranded in Italy. Husband betrayal story. Left behind on vacation, emotional revenge, travel betrayal, divorce revenge, family drama, husband humiliation, silent revenge, healing after betrayal, starting over abroad, toxic marriage escape, olive farm healing, abandoned wife story, finding peace after divorce, life lessons after betrayal, self-discovery story, soap business revenge. Part 1. Stranded in Italy. Cut off by my husband's cruel joke. Keyword, stranded in Italy. It took me a full 30 seconds to realize Ryan wasn't coming back. His laughter, sharp, deliberate, bounced off the stone walls of the narrow Italian alleyway as the rental car peeled around the corner. The taillights blinked once before vanishing behind a butcher shop and a yellow stucco arch. One of his friends, Zach, I think, shouted, "Let's see how she gets back now." More laughter followed. It echoed behind the cobblestones, like a dare thrown to the wind. And then, silence. Just heat, dust, and me. I stood frozen, mid-sentence. My mouth still open, the last word of our argument dangling in the air like laundry that would never dry. If you've ever watched someone turn your voice into a punchline, your presence into a problem, subscribe to Revenge with Seren. Because sometimes the cruelest betrayals wear the mask of humor. We had just come from a long lunch, seafood pasta, 2 bottles of white wine, cliffs that dropped into the Adriatic like something out of a postcard. It should have been paradise. But Ryan had been drinking faster than usual, cheered on by Zach and Leo, his college reunion crew from Chicago. I was a last-minute addition to the trip, not invited, tolerated. When I asked Ryan to slow down, he rolled his eyes. Zach grinned sideways. "She's always keeping you on a leash, man." That's when I stood up. I said I was heading back to the hotel alone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam anything. I just left. Ryan followed, slurring slightly but still in control. That was the problem with him. He always knew when to strike low, but quiet. "You're always right, Nina. Always planning, always correcting. Let's see you figure this one out." He motioned to my purse. "You've got your passport, don't you?" He didn't wait for an answer, just smirked, turned the key, and drove away like it was a joke only he understood. At first I waited. I thought he'd circle the block, swing back after proving some juvenile point. But 5 minutes passed, then 10. The street began to empty. Locals finished dinner, waiters cleared glasses. The golden haze of the Italian evening began to cool into something darker. I sat on a low stone bench and stared at the corner where the car had vanished. I reached for my phone. 1 bar, then none. I called Ryan. Straight to voicemail. I texted. Nothing. Then I called Zach, then Leo. Blocked. That was when the fear shifted. This wasn't drunken chaos. This was calculated exile. I checked my purse. 83 euros. My passport, thank God, was still tucked inside. But my credit cards? Gone. Ryan had offered to carry them earlier, so your bag doesn't get bulky. I let him, like I always did. Let him manage. Let him decide. Even when it hurt. I wandered the streets for another 20 minutes trying to retrace our walk. Our hotel was part of a coastal group tour. I figured maybe someone from the bus would spot me, but it was no use. They'd moved on. By 9 p.m., I was back where I started. A woman was sweeping the bakery steps near the square. I asked, broken Italian, panicked eyes, if there was a place to sleep. She looked at me for a long moment, then pointed up the stairs. The pensione room was small, bare bulb, one sagging bed, a sink that dripped, curtains that smelled like sun and detergent, but it was shelter, and I didn't have a better option. I lay on the mattress, fully clothed, my sandals still damp from the alley. I didn't cry. Not at first. I just heard his voice again. "You're so smart, Nina, figure it out." Around 1 a.m., I did cry. Quietly, into a pillow that smelled like soap and someone else's summer. By morning, no text, no call, nothing. I drifted through the market streets like a shadow of myself, hoping for a tour badge, a familiar voice, someone who might say my name. But I looked like a tired American tourist in yesterday's dress and a messy bun, and no one looked twice. I bought a bottle of water and a pastry with coins. That left me with 73 euros. Then I passed a pawn shop tucked into a side plaza. Not fancy, just a window full of watches and dusty jewelry trays. I didn't mean to stop, but I did. I looked down at my wedding ring. Not the original one. Ryan had replaced that on our 7th anniversary with a 2-carat upgrade, diamond flanked by sapphires, platinum setting, his "thank you for not taking the Seattle promotion." "You're too talented to waste time in meetings," he'd said. "I need you focused on us." I believed him. I stepped inside. The man behind the counter barely spoke, just examined the ring and said, 220 euros. I didn't haggle. I took it. The ring clicked against the counter like a door closing, and I didn't flinch. With that money, I bought a bus ticket. Not to Rome, not to Milan, to Brindisi, a small port town by the sea, a place I didn't know how to pronounce properly, but one where the ferries left the country, not circled it. As the bus pulled away, I looked down at my hands, one bare finger, one canvas bag on my lap, one decision I couldn't take back, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel lost. I felt free. The bus to Brindisi rattled like it had something to confess. I sat near the back, one row from the cracked rear window, watching streaks of sun flash across the sea cliffs. Every curve made the frame shudder. Below us, the Adriatic glittered with indifference, too beautiful for what I felt inside. I wasn't crying, but my throat had that iron taste you get when holding back something big. Would Ryan notice I was gone when he sobered up? Had he already moved on to the next stop in the tour, sipping espresso and turning my absence into a punchline? Was he expecting me to call my father, his favorite fallback? That was his safety net. Me calling for help, me solving the mess he made. But I didn't. All I had was my passport, 220 euros from a pawned ring, a bus ticket, a ferry schedule bookmarked on my phone, and silence, finally mine. It wasn't a plan. It was a refusal. Brindisi was smaller than I expected, less postcard, more working port. The air near the docks smelled like rust and salt and diesel. The ferry terminal was a squat building with peeling letters and plastic chairs that stuck to your skin. The digital board listed 3 evening departures: Corfu, Kefalonia, Ikaria. I chose the next one leaving. Ikaria. I didn't even know where it was. The ticket clerk didn't ask for reasons, just took my cash and printed a paper slip that felt like a passport to nowhere. That night, I boarded the ferry with nothing but a canvas tote, a scarf, and adrenaline. My seat was in a communal lounge beside a crying toddler and a couple quietly arguing over a map. The lights flickered. My body ached. But I stayed quiet. Because whatever this was, it was mine. No one was managing me, no one was watching, and no husband. The ferry reached Ikaria just after dawn. The sky over the Aegean looked washed clean. I stepped off the ramp into a town I couldn't name, blinking against the pink light rising behind terracotta rooftops. I didn't have a map. No contacts, no plan, no idea what came next. My phone was nearly dead. I hadn't charged it since the pensione, but I wasn't panicking. Not yet. I walked until I found a shaded bench facing the harbor. Fishing boats rocked gently in the swell. Olive trees lined the hillside behind the houses. The sun rose higher. My hunger followed. I hadn't eaten since that bread and pastry in Polignano. I wandered into a cafe tucked behind a post office and pointed to the cheapest thing I saw, espresso and a slice of bread with oil. The man behind the counter gave me a polite, wary smile. The kind people give to stray animals that don't seem dangerous but still make them nervous. I smiled back, but it broke halfway. I must have looked like a woman who had forgotten how. Outside, I turned right instead of left, followed a path that curved uphill past shop windows and hand-painted tiles. I wasn't thinking, just moving. The sun burned higher. My scarf slipped. My water bottle was empty. I took another turn and found myself in a grove, rows and rows of olive trees, their leaves trembling silver in the wind, their shadows stretching long across the dirt. And then the ground tilted. My vision blurred, my breath came sharp and fast. I fell to my knees, then all the way down. I remember the taste of dust, the press of warm stone beneath my shoulder, the sound of birds overhead, and then footsteps. Software hesitant. A woman's voice, firm and unfamiliar, spoke words I didn't understand. I opened my eyes to a face above mine, deep lines, kind eyes, a white headscarf, hands that moved gently but with purpose. She knelt beside me, murmuring something in Greek, and lifted my shoulders, pressed a bottle to my lips. I drank, water, cold and metallic. It burned and saved me at once. "Home," she said softly, pointing up the hill. I didn't argue. She led me, half stumbling, half carried, through the grove toward a stone house nestled in shade. The roof was red tile, the shutters faded blue. A line of laundry danced in the breeze like a welcome. The scent of basil and something baking drifted through the open window. Inside, she guided me into a sunlit kitchen and eased me into a wooden chair. Then a glass of water, a bowl of stew. I ate. I didn't ask what it was, just lifted the spoon again and again until the bowl was clean. She watched me eat, her hands resting in her lap like folded wings. Then she disappeared for a moment and returned with a cool cloth and a pair of clean sandals. I placed my palm on my chest. "Nina," I whispered. She mirrored the gesture. "Elena," she said. Then she smiled. A man entered, taller, gray mustache, work-worn hands. "Nikos," she told me, touching his arm. He nodded in greeting. A little cautious, but not unkind. She gestured to a hallway. Spare room, simple bed, a window cracked open to the sea breeze. I didn't speak. I just nodded. That night, I slept for 11 hours without interruption. When I woke, the house was quiet, except for the clatter of dishes and a distant radio. On the table near my bed was a plate of bread, figs, cheese, and a folded napkin. I found Elena in the kitchen. She was drying her hands on her apron. I tried to offer her money. She shook her head. "Rest," she said, and pressed her hand to her chest. I wanted to explain how I couldn't stay, how I needed a plan, how this wasn't what I had meant to do. But the words wouldn't come. Not in Greek, not even in English. So I stayed. One more day, then another. On the 4th day, I found an old adapter plug in a drawer. I plugged in my phone for the first time since Italy. There were no messages from Ryan, no missed calls, no apology. Just silence. I thought about messaging someone. My old boss in Seattle, or my friend Hannah, or even my sister. But I didn't. Because this time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a choice. By the end of my first week in Elena's farmhouse, I still hadn't told her much. But somehow, she already knew everything. She spoke almost no English, maybe 20 words, and never in the right order, and I didn't speak a syllable of Greek. And yet, with the way she set out breakfast each morning or gently guided my hands when I tried to help too soon, I understood her more clearly than I'd ever understood people who shared my language. She wasn't asking for my story. She just set a place for my silence, like it was something sacred. Elena moved with quiet purpose. She wore long skirts and aprons that smelled faintly of rosemary and wood smoke. Her hands, thick-knuckled, scarred from years of living, never rushed, never trembled. She handled dough, dishes, and emotion the same way, patiently. On my second morning, I packed my tote, the few coins I had, my passport, my scarf. I folded the thin blanket from the guest bed and left it neatly at the foot, smoothing the corners like an apology. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't belong here. I crept toward the back door, thinking I could slip away before she noticed. She noticed. Elena appeared in the hallway, a basket of folded laundry in her arms. She paused when she saw the bag slung over my shoulder. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her lips didn't tighten. She just looked at me. Then, without a word, she set the basket down on a nearby stool and took my hand, gently, like you'd guide a child out of a dream. "Come," she said. She led me to the main room and reached for the tin box that sat on the mantel. I hadn't paid attention to it before, just thought it was for coins or old papers. But it wasn't. She opened it and pulled out a stack of photographs. They were soft at the corners, some yellowed, others folded at the edges. She thumbed through them until she found the one she wanted. A young woman with dark eyes and a crooked smile. You could tell from her cheekbones alone, this was Elena's daughter. "Sophia," she whispered, barely touching the photo's edge. She showed me another. A baby. A toddler. A girl standing in front of a large airport sign. Then one more. Sophia alone, arms crossed, her expression caught somewhere between pride and distance. Elena made a rocking motion with her arms, then shook her head slowly. No grandchildren, no return. The tremble in her hand said what her words couldn't. I swallowed, set my bag down, nodded once. I would stay, at least for now. That evening, Elena handed me a bowl of peas and a colander. We sat on the back porch while the sky turned the color of honey. A dog I hadn't seen before, white, floppy-eared with one sleepy eye, curled at our feet. His name, she told me, was Bobo. Nikos joined us later, carrying a dented radio and a bottle of wine. He didn't speak much either, but when I passed him the bowl, he smiled with his whole face. His kindness didn't need translation. That night, I lay beneath a hand-stitched quilt in the guest room. The window stayed cracked open, and the breeze smelled like salt and lemon. I watched the ceiling fan spin shadows against the walls. How strange, I thought, to feel safe in a house where I understood nothing being said. But maybe that was the point. I didn't need words. I needed this. The next morning, Elena handed me a basket and pointed toward the back step. "Chickens," she said, and nodded. I nodded too. It took 3 tries and 2 startled hens, but I eventually collected 10 eggs without dropping any. When I brought them back inside, she clapped once and gave me a soft grin. Then she handed me a broom and pointed to the porch. And so it began. There were no formal invitations, no rules, no debt. But each task, sweeping, rinsing vegetables, folding towels, brought something I hadn't felt in months. Usefulness. Before Seattle, I had designed custom light installations, boutique hotels, vineyard weddings, luxury spas. I knew how to build ambiance, pitch mood boards, sketch lighting zones for ballrooms with 400 guests. But with Ryan, I was between things. He said it kindly enough. "You're in a soft season, Nina. Let yourself be supported." But it didn't feel like support. It felt like disappearing by degrees. The last project I touched before this trip? I couldn't even remember. And yet now, here I was, barefoot on a stone floor, dusting flour off my hands while Elena taught me how to fold dough into knots. I fumbled the twist. She laughed, light and fast, and said something I couldn't begin to parse. But I smiled anyway, because I understood. In the afternoons, I began exploring the edge of the grove. Rows of olive trees swept down the hillside like a green ocean. Nikos worked quietly among them, carrying pruning shears and a small knife he kept tucked in a leather holster. Sometimes he'd wave me over, show me how to spot a blight, how to strip dead branches without harming the core. I didn't know the Greek words, but I didn't need to. I learned by watching, by doing. At night, I slept hard and without apology. No more scrolling, no checking Ryan's social media. I hadn't turned my phone back on in a week. I didn't care what he was doing. One afternoon, while peeling potatoes in the kitchen, Elena pointed to the window and said, "Beautiful." I nodded. Then, on impulse, I unlocked my phone and opened an app I hadn't touched in months, my old portfolio. It loaded slowly, photo after photo, a glowing chandelier suspended above a mountain lodge, an amber-lit pathway through a rooftop garden, a set of hand-blown lanterns designed for a Napa wedding. I held the screen out to Elena. She took it like it might break, scrolled slowly. Her eyes widened. She tapped her chest, then pointed at me. "Artist," she said. The word hit harder than I expected. I blinked back tears. It was the first time anyone had called me that in years. Not Ryan's wife, not between jobs, not helper. Artist. I nodded. Yes, still. By the 10th day, the part of me that had survived on control began to stir again. I was used to fixing things, booking flights, organizing timelines, making sense of chaos. And while the olive groves of Icaria had wrapped around me like a lullaby, a quiet voice in my mind kept whispering, "You can't stay here forever." That morning, I packed quietly. My canvas tote held little, just my passport, some euros, and the old scarf I had used as a pillow on the ferry. I folded the borrowed dress Elena had given me and placed it gently on the bed, smoothing out the wrinkles like it deserved a proper thank you. I would slip away without hurting anyone. Without words I didn't know how to say. I imagined I'd leave a note, though I had no Greek and Elena had no English. I would just vanish softly, the same way I had arrived. I tied my sandals, lifted the strap of the bag over my shoulder, and then I heard it. The creak of the back door. I turned to see Elena standing in the hallway, her hands full of fresh laundry, her face unreadable. She glanced down at the bag, then back up at me. She didn't frown. She didn't raise her voice. She just stepped forward, placed the folded shirts on a nearby stool, and took my wrist gently. "Come," she said, just one word, and I followed. She led me back into the main room and walked straight to the mantel where the old tin photo box still rested. She opened it again, this time slower, with a kind of reverence. She pulled out a photograph I hadn't seen before, one taken in the very same kitchen, years earlier. A young woman stood at the table, arms dusted in flour, laughing. Beside her stood a child, a girl of maybe 6 or 7, her small fingers tangled in dough. And behind them both, Elena, younger, but unmistakably herself, smiling in the background. Sophia and her daughter. Elena didn't speak. She didn't need to. She pointed to the child, then made a sweeping gesture around the room. Then she placed her hand over her chest. Home. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she walked to the door, picked up my purse, and hung it gently on the wall hook where it had rested each evening since I'd arrived. And without a word, I sat down at the table. That afternoon, she handed me a pair of pruning shears and walked with me into the grove. Nikos was already there, his wide straw hat tilted low, moving steadily down the rows. The air smelled of crushed leaves and sun-warmed earth. Elena pointed to the branches and mimed the right motion. I began to work. It was slow at first, each snip cautious, tentative, but my hands grew more confident as the afternoon wore on. With each clipped leaf, I felt something release inside me, something brittle. Something I hadn't realized I'd been holding since the moment Ryan disappeared down that Italian road. We worked in silence, side by side. The quiet wasn't heavy, it was soft, companionable, the kind of silence that says, "You're not alone." When we finished, I stood back and looked at the tidy row behind us. Elena placed her hand on my shoulder, just for a second. Then she nodded once and turned back toward the house. That evening, as the stars blinked into the sky and the last of the supper dishes were cleared, I sat on the porch wrapped in a woven shawl she had loaned me. My phone sat on the table beside me, fully charged, untouched. I thought of Seattle, of the life I had left behind, of the woman I used to be. Ryan hadn't reached out. Not through text, not through email, not even through mutual friends. That silence no longer shocked me. What surprised me more was how little it hurt now. Elena stepped onto the porch and handed me a warm cup of herbal tea. She didn't sit, just looked at me, then at the sky. "Stay," she said softly. Only that. No pressure, no pity, just an open door. And I knew then that I wasn't staying because I had nowhere else to go. I was staying because, for the first time in years, I was choosing myself. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't broken. I was just beginning again. The next morning I found clean clothes folded at the foot of my bed. Sturdy pants, a simple cotton top, work clothes. The kind of clothes worn by someone who belonged. When I came into the kitchen, Elena greeted me with a nod, handed me a basket, and pointed outside. Chickens. Again. And so the day began, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as someone with a place in the rhythm. That evening, I opened my phone, not out of obligation, but curiosity. The messages were there, of course, a few from Hannah, a vague one from my old boss asking if I was still alive, and buried among them 3 unread texts from Ryan. They were all from the first week. 1. Where are you? 2. Are you serious right now? 3. You need to come home. This has gone on long enough. There was no apology, no regret, just control. Even in absence, he tried to dictate the narrative. I turned the phone off again, not in anger, in peace. Because the truth was finally clear, I didn't need to answer. It happened on a Tuesday morning, almost 3 weeks after I arrived in Icaria. The sun was still low over the ridge, casting long shadows across the grove as I followed Elena into the sorting shed. She moved with quiet determination, her hands wrapped in cloth, a basket of olives balanced on her hip. I had begun waking earlier each day, no alarm needed, just the internal pull of belonging. We worked in silence for a while, her sorting olives by size and color, me copying her motions. I had learned the feel of a perfect one, firm, smooth, no blemishes. The first week I'd been clumsy, overcautious. Now my hands moved faster, confident, efficient. When we filled the final crate, she turned to me, eyes bright, and said something in Greek I didn't catch. Then she smiled, walked to a nearby drawer, and pulled out an envelope. It was small, unlabeled, worn soft around the edges. She placed it in my hands, patting my fingers closed around it. "Your part," she said. I blinked. At first, I didn't understand. Then I did. I slipped it open. Inside, a modest stack of euros. Not much, maybe enough for a few days' meals in town, but it wasn't the amount that made my breath catch in my throat. It was what it meant. Not pity, not charity. Payment, fair compensation for work done with my own hands. I didn't cry, but I held that envelope like it was something holy, because, in a way, it was. Ryan used to call our finances streamlined. He handled the accounts, made the transfers, scheduled the payments. "Just so it's easier," he said. "You shouldn't have to worry about the details." But slowly, I had been erased from my own life. I had credit cards, but they were linked to his business account. I had an allowance, but only for personal purchases. If I ever questioned it, he reminded me how lucky I was to live without pressure, how I had the luxury of rest. What I didn't have was access. What I didn't have was agency. That small envelope from Elena felt heavier than any designer handbag Ryan ever gave me. That afternoon, we went to market. I hadn't realized it was a village event, rows of stalls lining the square, locals selling everything from honey to handmade soap to wooden carvings and jars of preserved lemon. Elena and Nikos had a simple table set up under a patched canopy, olive oil, soaps, a small basket of fresh bread with oil for dipping. Elena handed me an apron and gestured to the front. "Me?" She nodded, so I stood at the edge of the stall while locals drifted by. My Greek was still limited, but I had learned a few phrases. Enough to answer questions, enough to smile and point. We sold out of 2 boxes before noon. A British couple stopped by, asking about the soap. Elena nudged me forward. Yes, handmade, all natural, olive oil and herbs. From here. I pointed toward the hills behind the grove. They smiled. Bought 3 bars. At lunch, Nikos handed me a paper-wrapped sandwich and sat beside me under the tree. You learn, he said, tapping his temple. I smiled. He nodded slowly, then added, work good. You good. Simple words, but they reached places inside me that had long been neglected. We returned home that night, tired, sun-warmed, and covered in the scent of olives and herbs. Elena served a stew that made my eyes water with its spice. I sat at the table, counting the coins from my first sales, and felt something new settle into my chest. Not pride, not relief, but dignity. Later that week, I offered to help Elena organize her recipe notes. She kept them in a faded blue binder, written in looping Greek script with frayed corners and splatters of oil. We sat side by side in the kitchen, translating what we could into English and labeling jars with handwritten stickers. When I misread a word and labeled a jar of thyme as courage, she laughed so hard she had to sit down. Maybe true, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. In a way, she was right. That jar sat on the mantel the next morning. Courage. 2 days later, Nikos showed me the olive press. It was older than their marriage, he explained with gestures, passed down from his grandfather. He showed me how to load the trays, how to apply pressure slowly, how to let the oil separate from the pulp. The scent was earthy and clean, the oil golden green, poured into glass bottles like sunlight. You help here next, he said, pointing to the rows of empty jars. Me? He nodded. I wanted to ask, why are you teaching me this? I'm not staying. I don't belong. But I didn't, because something in me wasn't so sure anymore. That night I opened the envelope of euros again, smoothed them with my fingers, counted them slowly, like they meant something more than paper. They did, because this was money that had nothing to do with Ryan. It didn't come from his accounts. It didn't require his permission. It didn't come with his voice attached, explaining what I could spend it on. This was mine, earned with my own hands, not as a wife or a dependent, but as a woman. When I placed the envelope beneath my pillow, I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't check for messages, because nothing Ryan could send would change what I had found here. In olives, in sunlight, in hands rubbed raw from work, in silence that healed instead of hurt. The village market opened every Friday at 9, but by 8 the square was already humming. Farmers backed in their trucks with crates of tomatoes and melons. Elderly women laid out hand-woven linens on low tables. A young boy with wild hair rode his bicycle through the crowd, weaving between stalls like it was a game. And right there beneath a green and white canvas awning, Elena and Nikos set up their olive oil display, with me beside them. We had a rhythm now. Elena unpacked the soaps and jars. Nikos lined up the pressed oil bottles in rows, angled so the morning sun caught their amber-green hue. And I smiled. I welcomed. I answered questions in the limited Greek I'd learned and listened closely for the few English words tourists might say. But what I remember most that morning was a woman who looked at me, not past me. She was American, maybe in her 50s, wearing sandals and a wide straw hat. She picked up one of our soaps, sniffed it, smiled, then turned to me. "You're not from here," she said gently. "No," I replied. "Not originally." She tilted her head. "But you seem like you belong." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected. It wasn't said to flatter. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, one I hadn't made about myself until then. After she left, I stepped behind the table to straighten a row of oils. Elena touched my elbow lightly. "Name," she said, holding up a small paper card. I blinked. "Name?" She pointed to the display, where other sellers had cards printed with their names or family farms. She picked up a pen, held it out to me. My instinct was to write the name everyone had used for me, Mrs. Chandler. For 10 years, that had been my default label at every dinner party, every billing form, every travel itinerary. But I didn't. I wrote, Nina. Just Nina. I handed the card to Elena. She read it aloud slowly, letting the syllables roll over her tongue like something unfamiliar but welcome. She smiled. Good name. It was the first time in a long time I had claimed it. Not Mrs. Ryan Chandler, not the wife of an architect. Just Nina, a woman who sorted olives and helped pour samples of peppery green gold oil onto fresh bread. Around noon, the local pharmacist stopped by our stall. He greeted Nikos with a pat on the back and Elena with a kiss on the cheek. Then he turned to me. You, he said, pointing kindly, new, but already one of us. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It came out awkward and soft, like I'd forgotten how it felt to be seen as more than a passing visitor. By the end of the day, we had sold nearly everything. As we packed up, Nikos handed me a second envelope. He didn't say a word, just placed it in my hand, nodded once and kept loading crates. Inside, €50. My share. Elena turned toward me. Work good, she said. People like you. I wanted to answer with more than a smile. I wanted to explain what this meant. That after years of being admired for how I looked, how I supported, how I decorated our life in Seattle, I was now being respected for what I contributed. But I didn't have the Greek for that, so I just said, thank you. For everything. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was restless, but because I was full. With something I hadn't had in years. Agency. In our marriage, Ryan had always handled the introductions. This is Nina, he'd say. She used to do lighting design but now helps manage our household. Sometimes I'd smile, sometimes I'd correct him. Actually, I still freelance, but he'd brush it off with a charming laugh. She's being modest, he'd say. She's the reason I don't forget my socks or skip my vitamins. It was meant to sound loving, but it flattened me every time. Now, here in this village market, when people asked who I was, I got to answer for myself. No husband attached, no job title needed, just Nina, and that was enough. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to find Elena placing bundles of dried herbs into small paper bags. She pointed to each one, naming them in Greek: thyme, oregano, rosemary. Then she handed me a marker and a roll of blank labels. I took a deep breath. For the first time, I didn't just write the contents. I wrote, "Harvested by Nina." Later, as I arranged the bags into our market basket, I ran my thumb over the words. They were small, simple, but they were mine. When we arrived at the square that week, I saw the woman from before, the American with the straw hat. She waved from across the plaza. "You're still here," she said, delighted. "I am," I replied. "Longer than I planned." She paused. "You look different, brighter." "I feel different," I said. "I think I finally remembered my name." She didn't ask what I meant. She just nodded, handed me a few euros for more soap, and walked away with a knowing smile. I turned back to our table. Elena was watching me, her eyes warm. "You are strong now," she said. I shook my head gently. Number just clearer. We both laughed, but the truth was, I had never felt stronger. Because here, among olives and bread, herb bundles and broken Greek, I wasn't being reshaped to fit someone else's life. I was rebuilding my own, one label at a time. It came late in the evening, while I was wiping down the olive press with a damp cloth and humming under my breath. The workday had been long. Crates to sort, fresh herbs to tie, a new visitor from Athens who had placed a bulk order for soap. My hands were sore, but it was the kind of ache that left me satisfied, not depleted. I didn't check my phone often anymore. It lived in a drawer in the farmhouse kitchen, its screen usually dim, buried beneath flour-smudged recipe cards and Nikos's worn gardening notebook. But that night, Elena asked me to use the translator app to help her read the label on a box of imported spices. When I tapped the screen awake, I saw it. One new email. From Ryan Chandler. Subject, "I know where you are." I didn't open it immediately. I stood there for a moment, blinking at the screen like it might change if I looked away. My breath caught, only briefly. A reflex. The last string of an old habit tugging loose. I walked outside, stood beneath the moonlit trees. and finally read his message. Nina, it's taken months and a private investigator, but I finally tracked you to that back corner of Greece. This has gone on long enough. I'm coming to bring you home and end this ridiculous tantrum. My flight lands in Athens on Thursday. Be ready. Ryan. No apology, no question, just a directive. He still thought I was lost, still believed I was something to be collected, explained, folded back into the narrative he told about us at dinner parties. I could almost hear his voice saying it aloud, calm, annoyed, certain. I stared at the screen, then powered the phone off. Not in fear, but in clarity. The old version of me would have spiraled. I would have read the message 10 times, then cried over the sink. I would have drafted responses in my head, negotiated with my panic, tried to anticipate his mood, his next move, his tone when he arrived. But that version of me didn't live here anymore. She had been replaced, quietly, gradually, by the woman who now knew how to prune olive branches and tie linen sacks of herbs, who laughed easily with Elena and sorted sales reports by hand, who earned her euros one morning at a time. I went back inside and placed the phone back in its drawer. Then I returned to the table and helped Elena roll fresh pastry dough. The next morning, I didn't say anything at first. I watched the sun rise over the hillside and listened to the soft hum of birds in the trees. Then, over coffee, I slid the phone across the table toward her. She read the message, her brow furrowed. When she looked up at me, I saw no alarm in her eyes, only resolve. "Good timing," she said in broken English. Then she stood, opened the tall cabinet near the fireplace, and pulled out a folder I had never seen before. Inside, papers, legal ones, with my name, a partnership agreement. She handed me a pen. "I wait long time," she said slowly, tapping the document. "But now, time." I stared at the signature line. My name already printed neatly underneath. Nina Chandler, co-owner. "Elena," I whispered. She placed her hand over mine. "We build this. Together." My eyes filled with tears, not from fear, but from recognition. I signed. That afternoon I called Katerina, the only lawyer in the village, and asked her to meet me the next morning. I told her what I needed: divorce papers, dual language, straightforward, legal. She nodded. "I'll draft them tonight." By Wednesday evening, everything was ready. The documents were signed, the papers were copied, and an envelope waited on the kitchen counter. Thursday arrived with a perfect sky. Blue, still, indifferent. I was pressing herbs into a drying rack when I heard the car. Not the gentle putter of Nikos's truck, but the low hum of something newer, sharper, imported. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped outside. There he was, Ryan Chandler, standing beside a sleek silver rental, designer sunglasses perched on his forehead, his expression unreadable. He looked exactly as I remembered him, and yet strangely smaller. Not in stature, but in presence. He saw me and did a double-take. "Nina?" he said, stunned. What are you wearing?" I glanced down at my apron. My hands were stained with olive leaves. My face was probably sunburned, hair pulled into a loose braid. I smiled. "Clothes I can work in." He took a step forward, arms outstretched, rehearsed charm already slipping into gear. "I've come to take you home. I know you're upset. I know Italy was extreme, but come on, you've made your point." I didn't move. Behind me, Elena stepped into the doorway. She said nothing, just watched. Ryan glanced at her. "Is this the woman who's been keeping you here?" "She's the woman who gave me a home when you left me on a sidewalk in Polignano." His mouth opened, then closed. I stepped forward, handed him the envelope. "What's this?" "Divorce papers, signed, reviewed by counsel, with asset division already proposed." He took the envelope, fumbled it open, scanned the top sheet. His mouth hardened. "You're serious?" "I am." He looked at me again. Really looked. For the first time in a long time. "You look different," he said quietly. "I am." He hesitated. "You'll regret this." I nodded. "Maybe." but at least it'll be my regret. And with that, I turned. Not because I needed the last word, but because I didn't. The car disappeared down the dirt road with a low, bitter hum. Ryan never looked back. He didn't shout, didn't beg, just gripped the steering wheel with that same jaw-tight tension he used to wear in client meetings. I watched the dust settle in the air behind him, sunlight slicing through it like a curtain I would never need to close again. Inside the farmhouse, Elena stood by the window, arms crossed. "You okay?" she asked in careful English. I nodded. "He's gone." She reached for the teapot, poured us each a cup, and didn't press further. We sat at the kitchen table for a while, sipping quietly. The kitchen smelled of fresh lemons and thyme. Outside, chickens scratched near the edge of the garden. Everything was normal. Everything was new. When I finally spoke, my voice came out lighter than I expected. "He thinks I've had a breakdown." Elena raised an eyebrow. I smiled. "I haven't. I've just started living." She tilted her head, not understanding every word but grasping the meaning. Then she nodded and said the only word that mattered. "Good." That night, I walked to the grove alone. The moon was high, casting silver across the olive leaves. The trees stood like old women in prayer, still and knowing. I ran my fingers along the trunks, the rough bark cool under my skin. It hit me in waves, the magnitude of what had happened. I was free, not just from Ryan, but from the years I spent trying to be the kind of woman he wanted, soft-spoken, well-dressed, agreeable, someone who always smiled in photos, someone who gave up her job without protest, someone who was easy to explain at parties. Now I had dirt beneath my nails, new calluses on my palms, and a name that meant something again: Nina. Just Nina. In the days that followed, something shifted inside me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, like a quiet tide turning. I began working longer hours on the farm, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I asked Nikos to teach me how to check the trees for disease. I took notes, translated them, created a spreadsheet on the old computer tucked away in the pantry. I updated their inventory logs. I reorganized the drying racks by herb type and harvest date. One morning, Elena walked in, saw what I'd done, and placed her hands on her hips. "You," she said, laughing. "Boston brain." "Seattle," I corrected, smiling. "But close enough." That afternoon, I stood with her at the market table, watching the villagers pass by. One woman asked if we offered gift sets for the holidays. Elena hesitated. Then I spoke up. "We could," I said. "I could design tags, wrapping, maybe a seasonal blend." Elena's eyes lit up. "You do." Not a question. A trust. I spent the next 2 evenings sketching label designs at the kitchen table with a cup of strong tea and a bar of soap as inspiration. I pulled from my past life, fonts I remembered from boutique hotels, color palettes I'd used in wedding lighting design. It was like waking up muscles that had been asleep for years, but this time it wasn't for clients. It was for us, for me. The next market day, we launched 3 new bundles, wrapped in linen with handwritten cards. I watched as a young couple bought one immediately, pointing to the packaging and smiling. "It's beautiful," they said. For the first time in my life, I didn't deflect the compliment. I didn't say, "It was nothing." I just said, "Thank you, I made it." That night, I finally charged my phone again. Not because I was waiting for Ryan, but because I wanted to call someone else. "Hannah." She answered on the second ring. "Nina? Oh my God, where have you been?" "I'm okay," I said gently. I told her everything: Italy, Ryan, the Grove, the farmhouse. She cried halfway through. Then she said the thing that hit me the hardest. "I haven't heard your voice sound like this in years." "Like what?" "Like you." We talked for an hour. When I hung up, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt connected. Later, I found Elena sitting on the porch, knitting by the glow of a single bulb. I sat beside her and looked out at the darkness. "Do you know what I used to be?" I asked softly. She glanced over, waiting. I used to be someone who knew the light settings of five-star hotels but didn't know how to boil an egg. I used to design ambiance for other people's memories but never made space for my own. Elena reached over, squeezed my hand, and said something I'll never forget. "You remember now?" It wasn't perfect grammar, but it was perfect truth. Because I did. I remembered how to breathe, how to be proud of my work, how to choose myself, even quietly, even when no one clapped. That week I made a sign for the market table. "Olives and light," it read. Below that, "Farm-grown oil, handmade soap, designs by Nina." When I placed it beside our basket of bundles, something settled in me. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a beginning, the beginning of my real life. The morning Ryan flew back to Seattle, I was standing in a government office in Agios Kyriakos, filing paperwork under my own name. The building wasn't impressive, just a sun-faded two-story structure tucked between a bookstore and a post office. A single air conditioning unit hummed loudly behind the clerk's desk. A framed photo of the Greek president hung crookedly above a corkboard of handwritten notices. But to me, it felt like a cathedral. I clutched a folder of forms that Katerina had helped me translate the day before. Name registration, cooperative documents, partnership agreements. At the top of each, olives and light, official application for small business operation. I signed the last form in blue ink, my hand steady, my name clear, not as a wife, not as someone's +1, but as a woman standing fully in her own story. Elena stood beside me, wearing her usual navy headscarf and linen skirt. She held the bag of soaps and a sample oil bottle, just in case they asked for proof of product. They didn't. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a polite manner, took one look at our papers and said something in Greek that made Elena smile. "She say we are organized," Elena translated proudly, "very professional." I didn't laugh, but my chest warmed. That was new. On the ride back to the village, the truck bed rattling behind us, Elena turned to me and asked, "You scared?" I thought for a moment. "No," I said. "Just awake." That afternoon, we celebrated quietly. Nikos grilled sardines behind the farmhouse while Elena made a lemon cake with olive oil and fresh thyme. She pulled out 3 small glasses and poured us each a little ouzo, setting the bottle aside like it might be needed later. "To us," she said, raising her glass, "to olives and light." We clinked glasses gently. The ouzo burned on the way down, but I didn't cough. I just sat back, letting the taste settle into my chest like a second heartbeat. That evening I called Hannah again. "I registered the business," I said. "You what?" she squealed. "In Greece. Small operation. Elena and I." "Oh my God, Nina, I knew you were doing better, but that's huge." "It feels huge," I said. We talked for nearly an hour. I told her about the market bundles, the customer from Athens, the spreadsheet system I'd created for inventory. I didn't even realize how fast I was talking until I paused and she said, "You sound like yourself again, like before Ryan." I didn't correct her, because she was wrong, in the best way. This wasn't the before Ryan version of me. This was someone entirely new, and she had papers to prove it. The next morning, I woke up early. Too early, honestly, but I didn't mind. I walked through the grove, listening to the coo of mourning doves and the whisper of olive leaves overhead. When I reached the farthest tree, I crouched beside its trunk and placed my palm flat against the bark. A soft breeze lifted my hair. "You're part of this now," I whispered. Not because I believed the tree could hear me, but because I needed to hear it. Later that day, I made a simple flyer on Nikos's old computer, just 1 page, in English and Greek. Olives and light, hand-pressed olive oil, traditional soap, and seasonal herb blends, owned and operated by Elena Marakis and Nina Chandler. At the bottom, I added a contact number and a tiny olive branch sketch beside my name. We printed 20 copies and hung them in the bakery, the pharmacy, and the front window of the taverna. By lunch, 3 people had already asked Elena if we took orders. "Soon," she told them with a wink. That night, I sat on the porch with a notebook on my lap, sketching ideas for packaging and a website layout. The moon was half full, the air was cool. Nikos brought out a small box and handed it to me. Inside was a carved wooden stamp, our olive branch logo etched into its base. "For you," he said, his voice soft with pride. I turned it over in my hand. "It's beautiful." "You build this." "We help," he said. No one had ever said that to me before, not even Ryan. He didn't offer help, only instructions, corrections, silence. Now I had a partner who watched me work without judgment, a woman who trusted me with her family's legacy, a community that saw what I could offer without asking where I came from. That weekend, we sold our first official pre-orders at the market. One woman asked if I could add personalized notes in each box. "I'd love that," I said. I spent the next evening handwriting letters in both English and broken Greek, thanking each customer by name. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't flashy, but it was mine. At the end of the week, Katerina dropped by with our official certificate of operation, signed and stamped. She handed it to me with a sly smile. "Now you are really Greek," she joked. I laughed because I almost believed her. Not by birth, but by bond. By intention. And maybe that was the difference Ryan never understood. He thought power came from ownership, but I had learned that power also comes from planting roots where no one thought you'd stay. And staying anyway. The certificate hung beside the pantry now, framed in reclaimed olive wood, mounted with care. Not for guests, not for show, just a quiet reminder every time I passed by the kitchen shelf that the life I had once waited for had been waiting for me all along. It had been nearly 4 months since Ryan's tires kicked up dust outside the Grove. He hadn't contacted me again. Not a call, not an email, not even a final plea to reconsider. I suppose he expected I would eventually come back, that whatever phase I was in, this foreign farming detour, this independence experiment, would collapse under the weight of real life. But what he didn't understand was this: I had never lived until the moment he drove away. That summer, I harvested my first full row of olives alone. Nikos watched from the end of the path, nodding once when I reached the final tree and laid down the rake. Elena handed me a glass of water and a slice of honey-drenched bread. Neither said much. They didn't need to. By then, I had learned the rhythm of the grove, the sound of branches when the wind turned, the way leaves turned silver just before a storm, the way work tasted best when shared in silence. And I had learned my own rhythm, too. I no longer flinched at the word wife. I no longer measured my worth by what I contributed to someone else's vision. I no longer searched for Ryan's name in my inbox. Instead, I wrote my own name on every invoice, every label, every hand-stamped soap card. Nina Chandler, co-founder, Olives and Light. In September, a woman from Athens emailed us. She had visited the island on vacation, bought one of our gift bundles, and wanted to carry our products in her boutique. She called our packaging elegant, our oil exceptional, and our story brave. Elena laughed when I read that part aloud. "I just make soap," she said, but we both knew better. One evening, I pulled out my old journal and flipped through the first entry I had written in Polignano a Mare, the night I slept in a pensione above a bakery, believing that Ryan would come back, that I was overreacting, that it was all a mistake. I had written, "Don't panic, just wait. He'll explain. He always does." I stared at that line for a long time. Then I crossed it out. In its place, I wrote, "He left. I lived." I closed the journal and placed it on a shelf, not to forget, but to mark the distance between who I had been and who I had become. That fall, we hosted a small harvest gathering. It wasn't a party. Elena would never call it that. Just a table set up beneath the trees, some lanterns strung between branches, platters of food shared with neighbors who had supported us from the beginning. I wore a loose cotton dress, my hair braided down one side, no makeup, no shoes. When I laughed, it echoed through the grove. Someone raised a glass to the American who didn't leave. I raised mine right back. And when they asked what brought me to Icaria, I simply said, I followed something that looked like loss, but it led me home. There was a silence after that. Then applause. Not loud, not wild, but respectful. The kind you give someone not for surviving, but for choosing not to shrink. The next morning, I woke early and walked to the top of the hill behind the grove. The sea shimmered at the horizon. A warm breeze moved through the leaves like breath. I dug a small hole beneath one of the oldest trees, and there I buried my wedding ring. No ceremony, no monologue, just earth, just goodbye. I didn't bury it to forget Ryan. I buried it because it no longer belonged in my story. Later that day, I carved a single word into a flat stone and placed it at the base of the tree. Not his name, mine, Nina. Elena found me there just before lunch. She didn't ask what I'd done. She just placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You ready?" "Yes," I answered, and I was. Ready to stop measuring time by what had been taken, ready to start marking days by what I now built with my own 2 hands. That afternoon, I sat with Nikos under the pergola as we labeled a new batch of bottles. He was teaching me how to distinguish the notes of different harvests. "This one," he said, holding up a sample, "tastes of pepper and wind." I laughed. "That's not a flavor." "Here, it is," he said. We clinked glasses of oil instead of wine, and I understood. That night I lit a candle in the kitchen window, not for anyone to see, just for myself. To say, I'm still here, and I'm no longer waiting. Final reflection. What stays with me is not the ring, the road, or the man who vanished. What stays with me is the quiet moment when she wrote her name, on a business, on a label, on her life, and knew it finally belonged to her. If this story echoed something inside you, subscribe to Revenge with Seren, because freedom does not always arrive with fury. Sometimes it arrives on tired feet, with olive leaves in your hair.